Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the Science of Running. And I'm going to look at 3 different papers in this episode. One on avoiding injury, one on avoiding cardiovascular disease, and one on giving kudos and its impacts. So the first study I'm going to look at is one by Franson and others that's published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine very recently. And they did a study where they followed over 5,000 runners for a period of 18 months. They followed every run that they did on Strava, and they also asked that those participants in the study recorded any injuries they had. The idea of the study was to try to work out what factors related to training promote overuse running injuries. And they found that the best predictor of injury risk was doing a run that was more than 10% longer than the longest run that you've done in the previous 30 days. Let's have a look at some of the data from this study. So this is data looking at how many days individuals ran out of that 18-month period. So you can see there was quite a big variation, with some basically doing none at all and others running every day, and a whole continuum in between. The main thing this plot is showing is evidence that overuse injuries are a lot more common than traumatic injuries, and that the rate of increase of overuse injury with more running increases at a faster rate than the increase in traumatic injury. So traumatic injury would be something where you've fallen over. I mean, for me, I think in the last 5 years of running, I haven't had any overuse injuries, but I've had quite a few traumatic injuries. So I'm probably an abnormal runner. I'm particularly prone to falling over compared to other runners, but this suggests that most injuries are actually caused by overuse. So how do you avoid overuse injuries? Well, this is the most important graph from the paper. This is the relative risk of injury against a change in training load. So a change in training load is when you up your mileage, basically. What you can see here is with a relative injury risk of 1 and a change in training load of 1, that means that you haven't changed your training load at all. 1 is kind of like the baseline level of injury risk, and obviously nothing changes. But what you can see is as you increase your training load, so your relative risk of injury increases. Now, they came up with this simple rule that you don't want to run more than 10% longer. What you can see here is the 10% would be about here. You're getting a substantial, significant increase. This was the point at which they could already detect a significant increase in injury risk. But as you can see, it just gets worse and worse and worse the further you go over it. So take-home messages from this particular study: if you're going to increase your distance, do it gradually. Although they produced simple take-home rule about not increasing your distance more than 10% over 30 days, that would be a good thing to stick to, but it's important to also to take into account that 10% increase in that 30-day period, these are not thresholds. You don't get a sudden change at 30 days or a sudden change at 10%. What you get are general increases with injury risk the further you run, or the further you increase your training load. And you will get greater increases in injury risk the longer since you actually did a run of a particular length. So they're not threshold responses, but it's easier to kind of give people a simple rule to try and follow. And I would definitely recommend folks try and follow that rule. What we don't know from the study is how often you can increase your distance by 10%. Could you do it day by day by day by day and very, very quickly go from a short distance up to running an ultra by just running 10% further every single day? Well, the answer to that is we don't know, because there were 5,000 odd runners in this study, and there just wouldn't have been enough of them doing anything quite that wacky in order to be able to get the data to determine whether that has an injury risk. So don't assume that you can do something as crazy as increasing it by 10% every day. Just be sensible with it. Okay. Second study I'm going to talk about is one by Bashon and co-workers that was published in Quality in Sports, and it's looking at the impact of running on cardiovascular health. So they did a review. So this means they looked at loads and loads of other studies that have been conducted on running and cardiovascular health, and then looked for general trends and summarized the overall impacts. Now, studies clearly show that running is good for your health. All-cause mortality reduces the further you run. But the one cause of mortality, or there is one cause of mortality that has, in a number of studies, shown evidence of increasing with running rather than reducing with running, and that is cardiovascular disease. And that's concerning because cardiovascular disease is such a key killer. It's such an important factor in mortality rates. So running is good for you, but it might be bad in certain circumstances for your cardiovascular system. And it's particularly problematic for older individuals, and even more particularly for older men. So what does the study find? Well, there seems to be quite a bit of evidence of a risk of sudden cardiac arrest in marathon runners and ultra runners. This is another, this kind of ties in with the last study that I was talking about not doing 10% more. If you're doing an ultra, you're probably running way more than 10% more than your longest previous run. And you're not just putting yourself at risk of injury, you're actually putting yourself at increased risk of sudden cardiac arrest. Don't want to alarm anybody with this. The percentages of people that this happens to is still pretty low, but it does exist. There is an increased risk if you run long distances. More importantly, and I think the bigger take-home message from this review is what happens if you run at high intensity. So if you're running in zone 3. Studies have shown that for older athletes, if you run too much at high intensity, you get tissue damage, you get heart arrhythmias developing, and you can get hypertension developing. High intensity running generally, so for all groups, seems to promote the creation of plaques, so the things that cause heart attacks and strokes. It can promote atrial fibrillation, which is a very common heart arrhythmia problem that many people have, including both of my parents. And it can also promote right ventricular dysfunction. So it can cause your right-hand side of your heart not to function properly. There's some good news in here as well, though, because low and moderate intensity running, so running in zone 1 and zone 2, they actually reduce across the board risks associated with cardiovascular disease. So if you run at low or moderate intensity, you are making yourself less susceptible to cardiovascular disease. So this association between running and cardiovascular disease appears to be being caused only by running at high intensity. And indeed, other studies have found that running at lower intensity improves the functioning of blood vessels. It makes arteries more elastic, which is great, particularly if you've got plaques. It lowers blood pressure, and it's particularly important for older runners to be doing these things because it is really reducing your risks of cardiovascular disease. So what is this telling us? Well, it's telling us that training plans must be properly balanced. We must have lots of low and moderate intensity running compared to high intensity running. And I do despair at times when I see training plans that aren't at all balanced and which just seem to encourage people to be running at high intensity all the time. This is really not good. So training plans really need to be balanced. And I think this all again ties in with the very first episode I gave in this series, which shows that racing speed is maximized when you stick to the 80-20 rule. It's seeming likely that the 80-20 rule, which most amateur athletes do not stick to, they run too much at high intensity, also applies to your cardiovascular system and maintaining a healthy cardiovascular system. So not only will sticking to the 80-20 rule make you run faster in races, it will make your cardiovascular system healthier and reduce the risks of getting cardiovascular disease. So if you're not doing it to race faster, you should definitely be doing it to improve your health. So please do not engage in training programs that are not properly balanced and that are encouraging too much running at high intensity. And I'm going to finish off with a bit of a quirky study, one that was carried out by a group of Dutch scientists, Frank and co-workers, was published in the journal Social Networks. And obviously Strava is an important social network. And one of the things that happens on Strava is people give each other kudos. Now, this study found that people were influenced by getting kudos. The more kudos people got, the more they ran, and the longer runs they did. And interestingly, also, it was noticed that people were adjusting the runs that they were doing in line with the sorts of runs being done by the people that were giving them kudos. So people seem to be looking at who's giving them kudos, and probably because they're also returning the favour and giving kudos to other people's runs and seeing what those runs are, and then they're learning for what other runs other people are doing and adjusting those runs, adjusting their own runs correspondingly, going, oh, I like that run, I'll do that. And interestingly, that influence in terms of making people alter the type of running they're doing, that was happening just as much from people who don't run very much as people who run all the time. So don't think just because you're giving kudos and you don't run very often, you're not having an impact on what the people you're giving kudos to might be doing. They're just as likely to be influenced by your runs as they are with somebody who's running every day. Okay, so quite a cool study. And something I've noticed just in the last few months is that my Strava social network has become bigger than my Facebook social network. I now follow and are followed by more people on Strava than I have friends on Facebook. And I'm quite happy about that. Okay, right, cheers. That's it for me.